be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSE Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, ICANN 74 Insights from the Hague Meeting. My name is Christy DeMeo-Ziegler, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today is Gretchen Olive. Gretchen Olive is the Director of Policy and Global Domain Name Services for CSC. For over 2 decades, Gretchen has helped Global 2000 companies devise global domain name, trademark, and online brand protection strategies. Gretchen is a leading authority on the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers and the Domain Name System. Gretchen currently serves on the Names and Numbers Steering Committee of ECO, the Association of the Internet Industry, and has served on various INTA subcommittees. And with that, let's welcome Gretchen.
So thanks, Christy. As usual, a full agenda. This ICANN meeting was ICANN's first hybrid event where they had both in-person and remote participants. So a lot going on, a little bit new energy to the situation. So we'll spend just a few minutes at the top of the session just doing the ICANN overview, making sure everybody's on the same page. As usual, I see new faces or new names on the registration list, so I want to make sure everybody knows who we're talking about. Then we'll dive into the various ICANN policy development processes that are going on. We'll talk more about DNS abuse. Also, the GNSO has a new scoping exercise going on, so likely a future PDP, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then, as usual, just check in on what's on the mind of the GAC. So for those of you who are veterans of the series, you know that ICANN has 3 public meetings a year. We're in the second one that usually happens in the June timeframe. This is a policy forum. This is really more a working meeting as opposed to kind of lots of sessions talking about the accomplishments of ICANN or special interest topics. This is really where people are rolling up their sleeves and getting work done face to face. So ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, they're an organization that's largely made up of volunteers. There is ICANN, the organization, which is paid staff. There's a board of directors, and then under the board of directors are various stakeholder organizations, so SOs, as well as advisory committees. The advisory committee that we talk the most about is that dark gray box all the way kind of like to the right and to the bottom, which is a governmental advisory committee. You'll hear me reference them as the GAC. They're made up of various representatives from individual countries, typically from like their telecom ministry, that type of part of the government organizations. And they come and they're really looking at things from a public policy standpoint, and they're there to advise ICANN to make sure that those types of considerations are being contemplated as part of the policy-making process. The other group we'll talk mostly about is there in kind of the big blue box in the middle right under the board of directors. It says the GNSO, that's the Generic Name Supporting Organization. That's where registries, registrars, various constituencies like business users and intellectual property and ISPs, et cetera. This is where a lot of the policy making happens. Quite honestly, a lot bubbles up from that stakeholder group. And that's where we focus most of our efforts in this kind of our attention in this webinar series. So at any given time, ICANN will have several PDPs or policy development processes going on. Right now, there's a lot going on in PDP land, and these PDPs will will be kind of initiated by the different stakeholder organizations. The ones that we're here talking about today are coming up through that GNSO that I talked about. So the transfer PDP, throughout the history of ICANN and the public meetings, transfers of domains and making sure that that happens in a way where there's, minimizes hijacking, minimizes bad things from happening, make sure that things happen in kind of an orderly and predictable way. That has been the subject of a lot of kind of different PDPs through the history of ICANN. We're now on kind of another round of transfer PDPs. The GNSO launched this PDP in February of last year. They're literally looking at to see if there are changes needed to the policy to improve ease, security, and basically efficiency of the inter-registrar and inter-registrant transfers. So transfers between registrars and changing of the registrant, so from one registrant to another. So it's kind of broken out into phases. You'll see that as a theme throughout these PDPs, that kind of often these things are kind of, the work is put into phases or chunks. Phase 1A is really about the gaining and the losing forms of authorization for transfers, the auth info codes, kind of negative acknowledgement of transfers, so NACing. Phase 1B is about the change of registrant, and then Phase 2 will be about the kind of transfer emergency action contact and sort of reversing inter-registrar transfers. So, and also some of the dispute resolution policies. So, the transfer PDP initial report on Phase 1A was released just after the ICANN meeting. So it didn't come out right before the ICANN meeting. It came out just after the ICANN meeting. Public comment is now open through the beginning of August, so August 2nd. I provide you a link there so you can take a look at it. And, look at any time if you're able to submit public comments. It's always great for ICANN and the various groups that are working on these PDPs to hear directly from people who are affected by these policies. So as I mentioned, this PDP is now in active public comment. There are 21 preliminary recommendations. A big kind of chunk of the recommendations around what used to be, what currently is called the auth info code. They're kind of changing the nomenclature to transfer authorization code, or TAC. So you'll see a lot of the recommendations are around that, how it gets generated, that type of thing. So with that kind of behind the PDP working team, they're now kind of focusing their efforts and spent their time at ICANN 74 working on Phase 1B, which is about the change of registrant. So really, these are requirements that really are looking to prevent domain name hijacking and really making sure that any changes to a registrant are authorized. So always a good thing. We see in the news almost every day about things that are happening in the ecosystem where names do move from one registrant to another in an unauthorized way. So it's important that we tighten these things up. They're looking at also things like the 60-day inter-registrar transfer lock. So currently when you transfer a name gets locked for the first 60 days, so meaning it can't move to another registrar or another registrant, and then designated agent and change of registrant compliance. So a lot going on here, some interesting discussions. We'll continue to monitor this, but it is just tightening up current policies, which are definitely in order to stay ahead of the bad guys. Alrighty, the next PDP that is currently in progress is actually an ePDP. So let me explain what ePDP is. An ePDP is an expedited policy development process. So we first saw this when GDPR happened and ICANN had to take some expedited actions to basically have the community look at policies around WHOIS. And quite honestly, it's still going on, but in terms of getting to initial and final reports on some of the recommendations, that did happen in an expedited fashion. Here we now have, that was the first one in ICANN's history, was when that happened in 2018. Now we have another EPDP, and this is around IDNs, which is internationalized domain names. So these are domain names that are in different scripts than English. So you will see, Chinese, Japanese characters, Arabic characters. Those are IDNs. So the IDN EPDP team is really looking to provide the GNSO Council with some recommendations on the definition of all gTLDs and the management of those variant labels, as well as how IDN implementation guidelines should be updated. So, IDNs, when you look at the internet ecosystem, the DNS, the challenge is that most of the globe does not speak English as their first language. Most of the globe speaks other languages, Chinese, Hindi, Japanese, and so English is not the most popular, if you will, language among internet users. So it's, the IDNs have had some challenge from a technical perspective, having the browsers kind of properly recognize them so that things can resolve. There's also some policies that have kind of been, they're just different. They're different than gTLDs and English character, ASCII character domain names. And so, over time there have been improvements. We're certainly further along than we were, say, 10 years ago. But there's still some work to do to kind of make these work properly and for the policies to be in place to properly kind of deal with these and kind of have them be just, part of the ecosystem and operate in a really predictable way. So they plan to provide recommendations across 7 topic areas. One is TLD label validation and variant labels. We also have IDN variant TLD management, and you can kind of see some of the subcategories there. I'm not going to read those all to you. And then sort of IDN implementation. So that's kind of like the big buckets, if you will, with the subtopics below them. So really important PDP, one that, is one that I would say the broader community, the broader ICANN community doesn't necessarily think about every day, but there's some people who have some real great specialization that are part of this EPDP team that hopefully will help us get closer to these, kind of getting these issues resolved. So, where is this PDP, this EPDP? EPDPs are supposed to be kind of wrapped up within a year's time. So they're having to work really, really quickly. They completed their kind of first pass of some of the substantive deliberations on some of the charter questions they call in kind of that group 1 related to the definition of all the gTLDs and using kind of root zone label generation rules. So there's, things like puny code and some more technical things that they just are working through. They've also completed some initial deliberations of 7 of the 9 charter questions in Group 2, which is, related to some of the same entity principles. And now they're currently proceeding with some initial deliberations on Group 3 charter questions. So they're moving quickly, as an expedited PDP needs to under the ICANN bylaws. So, they're really, sleeves rolled up, really digging into it right now. Waiting for an initial report to kind of see where things stand. So once we have that, we'll know a little bit more about the things that that will likely change. So this IGO EPDP, quite a mouthful, I know. This is really a continuation on a prior PDP that happened on the kind of the tail end of some of the policy work that was being done around the first round of new gTLDs. There were a number of questions that came up during the kind of rollout of the first round of the new gTLD program by ICANN that, it just didn't work for these special organizations, these IGOs, these INGOs. These are organizations like, Red Cross, the Olympic Committee, UNICEF. These are organizations that have sort of a special place. They are not, kind of like true corporations in the sense of the word. They're not just a nonprofit. They hold this special place in society, and they have kind of some, interesting challenges in how they are, kind of exist in the world, and sort of special privileges are given to them because of the good work that they're trying to do on a global basis. So, this IGO EPDP is trying to pick up some of that unresolved work, that just didn't seem to get completely done as part of that initial PDP. And it's been put on that expedited track because we need to get to an answer on some of these issues. So things like, how do we handle an IGO which may enjoy kind of special jurisdictional immunity in certain circumstances? How do we deal with, the right and ability of registrants to file judicial proceedings in a court when it's against an IGO? How does that happen? How do we enable registrants the right to judicial review of initial like UDRP or URS decision? Also, kind of how do we recognize the existence and the scope of IGO jurisdictional immunity? So there's just some kind of very special things, kind of like challenges that we have when, regular, everyday Internet registrants are registering names that may conflict with names that are, or acronyms that are used by IGOs. So the initial PDP that I mentioned, they had done an initial report in 2021. It was open through October. So, sorry, I said the initial PDP. It's actually the EPDP's report was published, and the public comment ran through October, and now the final report has been delivered to the GNSO. That was in April, right before this meeting, and it's currently under consideration by the council. So because their final report's in, they didn't meet during ICANN 74, but I wanted to make sure that people realize this is still an ongoing EPDP, but it's getting ready to wrap up, and we should see kind of a summary of the comments come out very, very shortly. Now we're going to jump into some of these, EPDPs, PDPs that are probably a little bit closer to the home to the folks attending this webinar. And so we'll start with the WHOIS Temp Spec EPDP. So this was the first EPDP. So I referenced back in 2018, ICANN ran an EPDP. It was really to deal with the challenge that the GDPR kind of put on the table in terms of kind of the WHOIS policies related to domain names, particularly the ones that ICANN governs, the gTLDs. There was a direct conflict between the General Data Protection Regulations, the GDPR, and the WHOIS policies and provisions that were in contracts with registries and registrars. So at that time, that EPDP was divided into two phases. Ultimately, kind of, I would say a third phase, although it's called phase 2A, was added. But they divided the work into kind of two pieces. One was around the collection and handling of the WHOIS contact data and kind of requests for WHOIS data. And then the second was about access to the data by registrars, registries, ICANN, and other third parties. And then that added phase 2A was about kind of some issues that kept on percolating throughout phase 1 and phase 2, which was around natural versus, like, how do you treat natural people versus legal persons, and kind of the feasibility of using kind of an anonymized contact email within the WHOIS. Those were issues that were unresolved in phases 1 and 2, and actually then kind of evolved into phase 2A. So, that EPDP did start, in the summer of 2018, and the team did publish a report that put out the recommendations they had for phase 1 in terms of like the collection and handling of that data. What happens after that is, you know, the ICANN or is the need to then put together an implementation review team to determine kind of how to roll these recommendations out. That's when like the policy actually gets written. This team was supposed to complete their work. They were not under the same kind of constraints that an EPD, the EPDP part of this were under in terms of needing to publish a report within a year. But you know, the hope was, because WHOIS has kind of been, you know, in a terrible state with a lot of redaction and really, you know, day by day going darker and darker. The hope was that this kind of first part could be wrapped up pretty quickly, and you know, most of the energy and calories could be spent then on figuring out how to allow access to kind of the full set of information in appropriate circumstances. That was sort of what Phase 2 was trying to deal with. But the Phase 1 implementation review team has had some challenges. We've talked about that in prior webinars. There's been a lot of, you know, kind of frustration here. There's been some, you know, bad behavior that's happened. You know, the world changes. That's the challenge a lot of these groups have, and the longer they stretch out, the more change they have to kind of navigate, and that's been the case for the IRT team here. And there's a lot of dependencies because WHOIS is so central to so much that is in, you know, ICANN contracts with registrars and registries, and just how, you know, a number of policies work. You know, we talked about transfers just a few minutes ago. You know, the WHOIS has been a really important part of making transfers work properly, because you're kind of, you know, doing validation that, you know, a transfer is authorized by using email addresses, or that's the way it used to be, by using email addresses within the WHOIS. So there's just, you know, the kind of WHOIS is so central to so much that happens within this kind of ecosystem. But, you know, last ICANN meeting, there was kind of, I would say, sort of like, okay, let's stop complaining that this is taking too long. Let's put together a really detailed work plan, and let's figure out how we get to done. So that's what happened last ICANN meeting, and they really currently have their work kind of projected out to be wrapping up in early 2023, and then from there, and kind of an 18-month implementation window for registrars and registries, because there's going to need to be some changes made to systems. So in terms of this, they're at kind of the 40% mark. So, you know, we've got the rest of 2022 and the top of 2023. So far, it looks like they're on track with that work plan, but there's still a lot of work to do here. So, in terms of exactly where they are in that work plan and sort of the work that's left to do, they're, I would say, really in the guts of it right now, and that is, you know, drafting the complete gTLD registration data policy. The devil is in the detail here for sure, and there's a lot of opinions. So, you know, they're trying to work on agreeing on a timeline that can be shared for public comment, and the implementation times, you know, to kind of let the contracted parties, the registries and registrars, kind of know. They've been focusing on, you know, resolving conflicting interpretations of some of the recommendations that were in that initial EPDP report. They're looking at the requirements set by policy language for technical feasibility, you know, so having different fields, you know, removed, added, etc. Projection of the scope and time to take to task, you know, for these tasks to be implemented. You know, in the registry and registrar ecosystem, not all registrars, not all registries are created equal. Some are very, very small. Some are much larger and have much more complex systems. So there's, you know, a lot of things that they've been trying to juggle. But once the plan is formulated, it'll be published for public comment. That is currently, they kind of put out a date during ICANN 74 that they're expecting to publish that in the August timeframe of this year. So we'll be on the lookout for that. So now if we look at where phase 2 of this sort of like WHOIS Temp Spec PDP or EPDP is, you know, they had, again, they also met the time frames for getting their report done as part of the EPDP part of this. You know, they started in the summer of 2019, shortly after the board accepted the phase 1 recommendations. They completed their final report in August of 2020. The GNSO approved it. It went to the ICANN board. And, you know, I think what's happened over time now is the board has recognized that not everything that, when these PDPs happen and these recommendations come out in the reports, there is a lot that has to be figured out operationally. And a lot of times these reports are looking at things from a pure policy standpoint. Quite honestly, that's really what they're looking at, is from a pure policy standpoint without consideration of the operational components of it. And so this then created a new kind of process in the ICANN world of the operational design plan. So before the ICANN board can vote on this, they need to kind of have this operational design plan put together, and it has to include an operational design assessment to better understand the cost, the feasibility of the recommendations, because, you know, it's a lot like unfunded mandates that we hear about, you know, in kind of like, you know, legislative realms, is that it's all well and good to kind of say this is what we should do, but some of this it costs money, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes people and a lot of change. And so this is what ICANN's trying to get at with these kind of operational design plans, which are inclusive of an operational design assessment. So in January of 2022, the ODA was delivered to the ICANN board. I'm not going to go through all these, but what you're going to see here is that the kind of recommendations for the SSAD, which is sort of the system that would allow for, you know, to request and access full WHOIS data on a domain name for legitimate purposes, what was proposed is very expensive, will take a long time to implement, and may not be worth it, may not be feasible. And that's a problem. I mean, all this work was kind of like all this work and wrangling was done to try to get to this, like, you know, proposed, you know, set of recommendations of how this should happen and kind of how the system should be architected. And the team has come back and said, probably not a great idea. So this was really a kind of unique situation. You know, this is the first time the ODP was kind of required with the ODA. As part of that, and lo and behold, the team who conducted that, put together that plan and that assessment, wasn't in agreement that this was the best course of action. So the GNSO Council kind of, you know, these recommendations came through a PDP, you know, came as a part of the EPDP that came through the GNSO Council. The GNSO Council and members of the EPDP team kind of banded together and said, let's put together a small team on top of this year to consider the concerns outlined. And the ICANN board also sent shortly after that a letter to the GNSO and kind of put forward certain questions they wanted answered. And so that's what the small team is kind of focusing on now. So, you know, first has the ODA correctly interpreted the intent of SSAD? Has the ODA overlooked any aspects of the recommendations that should be factored in when ICANN considers this? You know, in terms of the concerns, what are the potential options that could be considered? You know, what changes, what proposed implementation or policy recommendations, if they got tweaked, might make this a whole lot better. And then also just, you know, like, can you look at this and really give some guidance? Because the answer that this is probably not the right way doesn't solve the problem. It just says that we still have a problem. So in April of this year, so, like I said, this team got formed in late January, kind of got started in early February. The small team delivered a preliminary report to the council, and they think the best way to kind of go forward is to try to develop a kind of proof of concept as a tool to evaluate and test assumptions. Like, let's not build this whole full-blown system. Let's maybe try a small test and see if that works to deal with this access to WHOIS problem before we kind of go full bore. So the council has recommended that, in light of this recommendation in the preliminary report, that ICANN pause any further consideration on the SSAD recommendations, and basically has asked ICANN, the organization, to help develop a design concept for like a lighter version of what the initial SSAD proposal was. So obviously, I think that's a good course of action. We need to solve this problem of access to the WHOIS for legitimate reasons, for law enforcement, for IP enforcement, all these reasons. But by pulling ICANN org into this, that is going to impact other work they have. So there needs to be some consideration of what impact that's going to be. And they're also, during this, there's going to do a consultation with the GDPR, ICANN board caucus, and other GNSO council members to kind of figure out the appropriate next steps in making this proof of concept idea come to life. So I like the pragmatic solution here, at least to the formulation of how we move forward here. I think it's been painful to watch. Each day, like I said, the WHOIS goes darker and darker. Bad guys are taking advantage of it. It's hurting security. It's hurting law enforcement. It's hurting IP interests. But I think instead of continue to spin and argue over the SSAD proposal, everybody's taking a step back. We're regrouping, rethinking how this can happen, how we can kind of scale this back. Start, by the good old, crawl, walk, run theory. I think this is a really good outcome right now. So we'll continue to watch this really closely. We've got a lot to cover today in this webinar, but I did, like the small team, as they were meeting at ICANN 74, they did share some of this kind of like the design overview from ICANN org that would potentially scale back the initially proposed SSAD. And so it really, is encouraging to see that they were able to get to an overall design concept pretty quickly. It's something that, to me seems pretty straightforward, but they're also considering some other proposals. So even though they're considering some other proposals, I think one of the kind of parts of the conversation I liked the most during ICANN 74 in looking at what ICANN org had kind of put together in terms of their design concept was how they could leverage the existing kind of ICANN technical stack, kind of systems they have in place now. So you can see, like the green is what exists today. The blue is what might be needed that's new, but it wasn't something, the development of those things weren't projected to be super expensive. It wasn't projected that it would take super long. So I think there's some real, while there may be other commercial solutions out there, and again, haven't seen them all. I think trying to use what you have to start with as a proof of concept, and then maybe kind of moving on to a more commercial solution might get us to where we need to go much quicker. So I thought this was encouraging. So, we've talked about phase 1, phase 2 of the initial WHOIS Temp Spec work. Phase 2A, they didn't meet during ICANN 74, but I just wanted to kind of make sure people understood where this stood. The final phase 2A report was published. This is around, the natural versus legal persons issues, things like that, and some data and anonymized emails. But the report did contain four recommendations, basically creation of a new registration data directory service field that enables registrars to designate natural versus legal person. It wouldn't be mandatory, but it could help, kind of expose more information. When it's a legal person, it's, the privacy, GDPR isn't dealing with legal persons, it's dealing with natural persons with personal, personal information. Also, there was some optional guidance there for registrars to kind of differentiate. So, like, create the field, allow registrars to differentiate and what they require from each. And then also the kind of anonymized email address, gave some further guidance there. So the board did approve the phase 2A recommendations at the last ICANN meeting. And so that's why this team didn't meet, obviously, at this ICANN meeting. And, staff has been directed to create an implementation review team. So the challenge is there's so much interdependencies between these. It's like, kind of a lot of like people running in parallel, and we hope someday they all come together. So we'll continue to watch this and let you know how that evolves. So now we're going to switch gears out of the WHOIS, and we're going to jump into what's called the new gTLD Subsequent Procedure or SubPro PDP. This has been going on for some time. This was after the new gTLD program kind of rolled itself out, and one of the things ICANN promised the Governmental Advisory Committee is that they would look back and see what went well, what didn't go so well, and propose corrective action. So one of the look-backs was around the procedures related to the policies and the procedures of the rollout of the new gTLD program. And for those of you who are familiar with that program, there was something called the Applicant Guidebook that kind of spelled out attempted to spell out the process, everything from who was eligible to apply through, what you needed to do to apply, to how any kind of challenges or objections would be handled, all the way through to kind of delegation and contract. So it was a pretty hefty document that really was sort of the Bible, if you will, for this new gTLD program rollout. The new gTLD SubPro PDP really focused on considering that, kind of the first round, everything that happened in the first round. There was a lot of stop, go, stop, go, stop, go. It was not a very predictable process. There were a lot of kind of surprises and things that weren't contemplated. So this PDP had kind of a 40 separate topics identified in its charter, and they kind of tried to break those down into different work tracks that I have listed there. So this, this PDP kind of winded its way through those issues. Started at the top of started, I guess, late 2017, top of 2018, and I guess it was in 2017 when I think about it. July 18, really, initial report came out. Then we had final recommendations in August 2020. Published the final report in the top of 21. The GNSO approved that report. The ICANN board, once the report is sent to them, the final report is sent to them, they have kind of 6 months to take action. There was still kind of some issues, and so ICANN decided, in September that we needed to, last September, that we really needed to initiate a subsequent procedures operational design plan here. Again, a lot on the table, 40 different charter questions, a lot that would impact the operations of ICANN and how the application process would work. So an ODP, which would include that operational design assessment, was kind of requested. So, the ODP is really looking at the cost, the resource requirements, timelines, dependencies, all within the global public interest framework to basically make this happen. The costs are obviously, and timing is important. There are a lot of people, who really want to see the next round of new gTLDs happen. When the first round happened, early on in kind of some of the policy wranglings that happened as that program was launching, ICANN had kind of made a commitment that they were going to launch the second round within a year's time of kind of successfully launching the program, kind of the close of the application period. Obviously, the first round happened in 2012. We are now in 2022. It's been 10 years. And there were, a number of people and companies who thought they weren't going to have to wait 10 years. They might not have thought it was going to be a year, as initially articulated, but they didn't think it was going to be 10 years. And there are folks who have, aspirations of having their own TLD, companies and investment groups. So there is a definite appetite out there to kind of get to the next round. But there is also a recognition at the same time, and I think a strong desire by a lot of people in the ICANN community to make sure that we really learn from the first round. And so this is, this ODP is really trying to get to kind of brass tacks, like what is it we need to expect that this is going to take to get there. And so it's a big question that's been burning. The board has requested that the ODA, which is the assessment part, be delivered within kind of 10 months, so the clock is ticking. So in terms of like what does that timeline look like, I know this is something you probably have to squint to read here, but you'll see kind of just about a little bit right of the middle of the page where that kind of larger gray bar goes across. You'll see a little red arrow that says, we are here. We're a little bit past halfway of getting the ODP put together. There's still work to do, but we're getting closer to kind of knowing what it's going to take to get these policy recommendations that have been made as a result of the PDP, what it's going to take to make those happen. I think the bigger question, though, in a lot of people's minds is, okay, this ODP process, 10, 11 months will get that done good, and we're more than 50% through that already. But what happens after? Like, what all has to get done? What all has to come together after the ODP? And this was another visual that was kind of presented during ICANN 74 to give people an understanding of that. So it kind of breaks it down into 3 stages: the policy development, the implementation and design, and the operation. I will also tell you probably a few things not on here. There's things that, but the things that are on here are not simple tasks. They are tasks that take time. There are dependencies. I say that in kind of a way, to kind of make people understand and recognize that, the next round of new gTLDs are not going to happen next year. Not going to be 2023. I think there's some who think, well, maybe 2024. Potentially, very late 2024. I really think, and I know through this webinar series, you know, I've been sort of on the side of the fence that this is going to take much more time than people really want to admit. So I'm probably in the camp at this point that we're looking at 2025 or later, but we'll continue to watch this. But it is, you know, again, sort of affirmation that this is not a linear path. This is something that there's a lot of dependencies, a lot of things that have to happen, and agreement, that consensus that has to be reached to get to the next round. And so I don't think that's because I don't want the next round to happen that I'm saying that. It's because I just think it's really important that we're all realistic, because I think there's a fair number of people in the market who are trying to say that's going to happen sooner, and I don't want anybody to have that false expectation. So to give you a sense of sort of the priority issues for in the minds of the GAC related to subsequent procedures, and kind of like making sure that these things are sorted out and have a clear plan for implementation, is around, you know, they really want to make sure that this next round, the GAC has been abundantly clear in their communiques, in their, you know, communications in public meetings, that in order for the next round to happen in a way that is acceptable, there needs to be predictability. There needs to be clarity around registry voluntary commitments and public interest commitments. This was something that kind of happened and was formulated during the rollout of the first round, where there are certain TLDs that, you know, they impact the public interest to a great degree. There's they serve highly regulated communities like financials or law enforcement or, you know, pharmacy, those types of things. There need to be certain public interest commitments, and there needs to be clarity that not only do they need to put that in their application, but there has to be the ability to enforce against those by ICANN of those public interest commitments. And then there's some registry voluntary commitments that are made to kind of better serve a community or better serve the kind of the greater internet community. Applicant support, there was a feeling in the first round that, you know, English-speaking companies and investment groups in North America and Europe were at a great advantage, and those in other areas of the world who do not speak English, who maybe weren't as highly funded or had the resources necessary to get a consultant to help them put together an application, that ICANN didn't do enough to support those applicants. So, you know, the GAC is really looking for this SubPro group and the implementation plan to really speak to how the applicant is going to get supported in regardless of kind of resources and language that they speak. This issue of closed generics continues to linger. This is where a generic word is a top-level domain, and it's like one of these category generic words like, you know, books or, you know, bank, things like that. How should that be handled? Should they be closed? Should companies be able to have kind of own that namespace to themselves? There's an upcoming what they call facilitated dialogue between the GAC and the GNSO on this, because there's been a number of efforts. We won't go into them here today. There's been a number of efforts to kind of get agreement on that. And the sides are getting closer, but they're not yet aligned. So there's an upcoming facilitated dialogue. It's sort of like a mediated discussion, if you will, between the GNSO and the GAC to see if they can get in alignment. The issue of name collisions, we saw that crop up during the first round where there were a lot of companies within, within their network. They may have used dot something just as sort of an internal TLD, not something that was going to be, used or recognized on the internet, just a way for them to kind of handle things internally. And that wound up with some of the new gTLDs that were applied for, especially things like .home, caused some potential, had some chance of causing some potential problems. So, making sure that we're really clear we got the name collision issue, we're properly doing the right considerations as round 2 happens. Then there's, GAC consensus of ICE and GAC early warnings. These were different opportunities for the GAC to weigh in on applications. And the first round policies really required the GAC to act very, very quickly, typically more quickly than most governments can react. So that was a problem. And then just the process by which they had to participate and kind of like monitor things, that wasn't very compatible either. So that needs to get sorted. Community applications, making sure that there's more clarity around those and how communities, everything from a geographic community to a cultural community to a community of people with like interests. Those community applications, there needs to be more clarity around that. And then finally, auctions. There's a feeling from the first round that the auction process wasn't quite right, that some applicants applied with the intention of gaming the auction system to make money off an application they never intended to proceed with. So, issues like that, a number of issues around auctions. So these are the things that the GAC is looking really hard and close at and wants to make sure is resolved before the next round goes to market. So we went through a bunch of the very specific concerns that the GAC has about, kind of like the subsequent procedures and sort of getting to that round 2. They also have some overarching concerns around making sure the reviews that have happened and the recommendations that have come out of those actually happen, that kind of making sure that DNS abuse is something that's overarching over all this, and we have to make sure that we're not going to be causing more risk on the internet and more issues around security. We have to make sure that we're doing all that we can to mitigate abuse through this next round, as well as sort of that objective analysis on costs and benefits. The GAC has clearly stated, hey, they are not trying to delay the second round. Hey, they are not against the second round, but they want to make sure that all the necessary analysis is done and that we go into things wide open, eyes wide open. So we've gone through all the PDPs out of the GNSO. Thanks for hanging in there. Just want to give you a heads up. The GNSO has also spun up an accuracy scoping team. This is around the accuracy of the WHOIS. I expect as a result of this team's work that we'll be getting eventually to a PDP that will work to try to make the WHOIS more accurate. This has been an issue since the beginning of time. There have been little improvements along the way, but we need to get a lot further in this battle. So certainly more to come on this one, but just wanted to let you know it's on the radar. So coming down the home stretch now, even though this was a policy forum, and, obviously the PDP is very important, talked about the spin-up of the accuracy scoping team. The other major issue, not only in the GNSO, but just across all the different stakeholder organizations, is DNS abuse. We've been talking about this for those of you who participated in this series for some time now. It's something here at CSC we're very focused on because the problem is not getting smaller with DNS abuse. It's only getting bigger. It's chronic. It's really something that gets magnified by outside events, and there's really still no common definition of what qualifies as DNS abuse, but I think we all know what bad actions are. And so let's talk a little bit more. So we talked last time about the recent EU Commission study on DNS abuse. I'm not going to go through all that again, but just wanted to remind you of this. I mean, this is a really good kind of articulation of some of the challenges, and really proud that some of the CSC resources part of their study. You know, in terms of what's being done, you know, we've also talked about this, that it's a very patchwork approach. A lot of people feel that, you know, ICANN and the contracted parties within ICANN can do a lot more. I think that's true. The GAC is looking at this issue from their public safety working group, and the gTLD registries have been sharing their experience. They have less abuse in gTLDs, and I don't think that's by accident. So, what changed? You know, what advanced here on the discussion around DNS abuse at ICANN 74? As I mentioned at the top, the discussion is expanding. It's beyond, you know, a couple of groups talking about it. Just basically, you know, the GNSO, the at-large, which is ALAC, the CCNSOs, the GAC, everybody is talking about what can be done to mitigate DNS abuse. The GAC has clearly stated they want to see enhanced abuse reporting by ICANN, improved contractual provisions, and targeted PDPs to try to address that. I think it's good to get that list out there. I think the GAC is extremely influential in what happens at ICANN. We've talked about their growing influence, and I think it's great that that list is out there. The GNSO Council has also created DNS abuse small teams, so similar, you know, to what's going on with, you know, around the PDP related to the access to WHOIS. Here's another small team that the GNSO Council has spun up, and they held a session to kind of identify opportunities and next steps. So things like, you know, prioritizing action and contractual compliance. Also, you know, looking at specific issues or recommendations. You know, maybe we can't solve all of them, but let's like try to figure out what can be done little by little, issue by issue. So I think, you know, this is a good start. I don't think, again, it's going to be the full solution. I don't know that ICANN can be the full solution. I don't think so. But they definitely, and the ICANN community definitely has a very large role to play here. So why this is all going on, I mean, a solution is not around the corner. My colleagues often hear me say that technology is often ahead of policy. And I think that's going to be the case when it comes to the DNS abuse. But I think, you know, we have to make sure our clients, you know, organizations around the globe recognize the threat is high. Many national cybersecurity agencies have issued alerts. You'll see like CISA's Shields Up alert, the NCSC advisory. These are just a few, just a small handful of all the ones that have been issued by various national governments and cybersecurity agencies. We have a domain security checklist that can help you enhance your cybersecurity posture. These are things you can do to improve your domain name security. Most of your security teams are really looking inside the firewall. These are things that you can do to your domain names, to your digital certificates, to your DNS to help further secure. These are things that are not very expensive. In some cases, like CAA records on DNS, really no charge at all. So if you'd like a copy of our domain name security checklist, please put your name and organization and email address into our Q&A box, and we will, here in this webinar, and we will get that to you. You also may have heard that through the early months of this year, we have also released our domain sec platform, and the first product off that domain sec platform is 3D monitoring enforcement. And that also can be a great way for you to protect your organization in a way that you currently cannot do through regular domain monitoring. So this is just a kind of a little visual of, like how we've been thinking about DNS abuse and how we can help protect our clients in the DNS and the domain name ecosystem. There's internal threats and there's external threats, and your security teams are doing a fantastic job, keeping your network secure. But there's a lot that happens outside sort of this red line, outside the firewall. And really it's the global domain name portfolio that is in the center of all this. And so, again, if we look at the different indicators of compromise and we look at the different threat vectors, there are, again, things you can be doing to your domain name portfolio, which includes your DNS and SSLs to better protect you. And that's what we really work to try to do here. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to spend a ton of time talking about all the intricacies of our new 3D monitoring. We have some other webinars on that. We also have material we can send you. So again, also if you're very interested in learning more about this, put your name, your organization, and your email in our Q&A box, and we will have someone reach out to you. But I think, probably the best way I can describe this quickly is, our 3D monitoring really looked at domain names from a 360-degree approach. And, we're not just looking at names that are registered. We're looking at registered, dropped, re-registered. We're correlating data. And really what it does, kind of like this picture, I hope helps explain it, is that kind of like the old way of domain monitoring gives you that sort of very fuzzy, pixelated picture. But through our 3D monitoring, which uses machine learning deep search, you're able to get a real 3D picture, a real clear 3D picture, and you're able to enforce around the things that are providing the greatest threat to your organization. So if you want to know more information, again, please put your name, organization, and email address into the Q&A, and we'll have somebody reach out to you. So just to wrap up ICANN 74, as I've mentioned before, the GAC becoming, I shouldn't say becoming, they are highly influential. And so those of you who have attended this series before knows that I kind of have this little phrase that says, watch the GAC. What the GAC is thinking is typically what the most important, most challenging issues are in the ICANN space, and will give you a very good sense of the direction in which things are going. They've been growing in number. Certainly the pandemic, we saw even further growth, but they really are, they kind of help everybody prioritize and focus for sure. At the end of every ICANN meeting, they put out what's called a communique. It used to come out the last day of the ICANN meeting. Now it's starting to come out several days after the end of the ICANN meeting. I think it takes them some time to kind of summarize, similar to like putting together this webinar. It takes a little bit of time to summarize a whole week's worth of work, but nonetheless, their communique this time kind of highlighted these 7 issues that are kind of what they call issues of importance. So again, I think I won't read them all to you. I think you can see this is where their attention is right now, and some of these are pretty thorny issues, ones that are going to take a little time to work through, but this is where, the GAC really sees the need to focus and to get these things resolved, because these are things that are causing challenges for Internet users of all kinds. Whether you're a private citizen, a company, et cetera, these are the issues that need to be resolved for things to run better, and there'll be a new set right after that, so the work never ends.